where do you get the constitutional authority for this? And Representative Clyburn just looked and said, well, most of the things we do up here have no constitutional authority. But that's the problem. And it didn't just start with President Obama. It's been going on for 60 years. Really since the late 1930s, and since FDR was in long enough to appoint most of the Supreme Court justices, early in his reign, many of the things were struck down that later on they began approving. Not because they became more constitutional, he just changed all the Supreme Court justices. But since then, we've had a gradual evolution, and we tolerated it for a long time, bigger and bigger government and more deficits. But you know, we've been consuming our wealth as a country for a generation or more now. And I don't think that an individual or a people or a country can live forever beyond their means. If you live beyond your means, you'll eventually live beneath your means. I think that's what's approaching. I fear also that what's approaching may be a time when the debt is so unmanageable that we just simply start the printing presses to pay for it. You can pay for your debt or your bills or your budget through taxing people, but most of us think we've been taxed enough already. You can pay for it through borrowing. We've borrowed $800 billion from the Chinese, $700 billion from the Japanese. We won the Cold War, and yet we now owe the Russians $140 billion. The list goes on and on. Where we were once a great country that exported things, our number one export now is our debt. I think we live in times that we need to wake up as a people before it's too late. Fortunately for our movement, this is a big year. I tell people there has never been a more perfect constellation of things coming together all at once for our movement. I think this is the year of the outsider. I think it's going to be a big Republican year. I think we're going to change a lot of faces. There's now talk we could even take over the House or the Senate, which a year ago people would have said was impossible. It still is an outside chance. But I do tell people when we go through a primary process and we select who our next Republican will be, that political parties are an empty vessel unless we imbue them with values. I believe strongly in the Republican platform. The main chastisement that I sometimes put out is that we haven't always lived up to our platform. When we were in power, the debt went from $5 trillion to $10 trillion. We didn't veto any bills. We didn't cut any spending. My congressman would come home. He was a Republican. I say, you get an A+ for cutting my taxes, but you get about a C or a D for cutting spending. It's always easy to give you a federal project and to give you a tax cut. You all want, it's easy. It's just those things, everybody wants them. It's harder to say we're out of money and that it's an illusion of wealth to give you these things. $4,500, you know, who doesn't want $4,500 for a car? It's an illusion. There is no money up there. It has to be borrowed from someone or printed. We're getting to the point where we are borrowed to such an extent the foreigners are going to quit loaning us money. Chinese have slowed down their buying of our debt. The other way we pay for our debt is simply by printing money. And we printed an enormous amount of money. During the crisis or the panic of 2007, we doubled the monetary base. That's currency and bank reserves. That money hasn't hit the system yet, but when it hits the economy, you're going to see higher prices. And you could even get to the point where you might even destroy your currency. I fear we're going to see 1979 again or worse. I saw today the fourth quarter earnings reports. I guess you call them earnings reports. It's quite a misnomer when you're talking about AIG. They lost another $8 billion last quarter. We've put in close to $200 billion into one company. We should have allowed organized bankruptcy and new ownership. Now the government essentially owns them and appoints the people, and the government's not going to be any better than the previous management. We need new ownership, but they need to go through bankruptcy. New earnings report for Fannie Mae, government entity that covers a lot of your mortgages. 75% of the mortgages are government-sponsored, Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac. Fannie Mae lost $16 billion last quarter. So what's the answer? They want $16 billion more to bail them out again. They have right now an unlimited credit line. You're the credit line, basically, but we've given unlimited. And instead of reforming the process, what are we doing again? We got in the housing fix because we made interest rates zero. We made them below the market rate. We're doing the same thing now. We're trying to encourage another housing boom. The only way we get out of this crisis is we need to allow prices actually to fall. Prices have to find their bottom, and when they do, some good things will happen. When houses find their bottom, poor people or young people that are just getting started, when that $150,000 house is $75,000, we'll begin to buy again. The houses will fill up and we'll get out of this. But no amount of government intervention is going to change it. In fact, government intervention is just going to bankrupt us as a country. We have to allow the marketplace to work. We have to allow, while nobody likes it, we have to allow bankruptcies to occur and new ownership to happen. In our town, Fruit of the Loom went bankrupt a few years back, and Warren Buffett bought them. So through bankruptcy, there can be some good things happen. Contracts are renegotiated. The executives obviously aren't going to get multi-million-dollar bonuses, which they all got when we bailed these companies out at your expense. We've done very well with our campaign. We've raised nearly $2 million. We've gotten some good endorsements. We were endorsed a couple weeks ago by Sarah Palin. We've been endorsed by Gun Owners of America. I'm a big defender of the Second Amendment. I'm also a big defender of what a proposition they have in Frankfurt called the Firearms Freedom Act, which I would suggest you look into. We've gotten the endorsement of Steve Forbes, who many of you will remember as a good businessman and also a promoter of the flat tax. We've gotten the endorsement of the Reagan PAC, and we've also gotten the endorsement of the pro-life group, Concerned Women of America. I thank you very much for coming out today. Their petty earmarks. Well, an auditor found recently that the state of Indiana placed 8,591 earmarks on the Homeland Security bill. And you might ask yourself, what are these potential terrorist targets in Indiana that they're protecting with your money? Well, let's see. Old McDonald's petting zoo was on the list. The Amish popcorn factory was on the list. The Mule Day parade was on the list. This is your federal money being earmarked for national security to protect these sites. Indiana had more requests than the state of New York. Now, I'm not saying we don't spend money on Homeland Security, but I'm saying we don't earmark it. We don't spend it based on the seniority of the representatives. We base it on where we might be attacked. New York City, Washington, D.C., probably Los Angeles. You base it on realistic observations of where you should spend money. But so much money in Washington is based on seniority. I think the system is utterly broken. We have a system of pork barrel spending where you have a senator like Byrd, Robert Byrd from West Virginia, a Democrat, who's paved every inch of West Virginia. The money's being sent to West Virginia by the bucket load based on his seniority. Not based on the quality of the projects, but based on his seniority. But before we get all up in arms and say it's just those darn Democrats, you remember Sarah Palin talking about the bridge to nowhere. That was an earmark by a Republican congressman who'd also been up there for 50 years. On both sides of the aisle, they earmark. There are people in our state that do it. I mean, it's happening everywhere. I think it's easy for politicians to come to London and say, what can I get you? What do you need? What kind of federal projects can I bring to London? What can I build for you? How can I create 100 new jobs in town? But the problem is every representative across the United States is doing that. They're doing it in Ohio, Indiana, Illinois. Everybody's coming home, and they see their job to be errand boys or errand girls for you. They're supposed to snatch as much up of the federal dollar as they can and bring it back to your locality. The problem is that the till is empty. We all know it is empty. We're starting to be more concerned and more worried about it. I think that's what this Tea Party movement is worry and concern that can we continue to thrive and exist as a nation with so much debt. This year the debt will be nearly $2 trillion. They just increased the debt ceiling to $1.9 trillion. And you might say, well, I read in the newspaper it's only $1.4 trillion. You know what the difference is? They don't count so much of it. The money they borrow from Social Security Trust fund, they just don't count it towards the deficit. Now, when they raise the debt ceiling, you see the real number. But they borrow a couple $100 billion from Social Security, a couple $100 billion from Medicare, a couple $100 billion from the Highway Trust Fund. You know, I'm not against building roads, but the Highway Trust Fund should be off limits from the general fund, and that's the money that should be spent. What money we have, and we don't spend more than we have. But that's what's going on. You're borrowing from all the trust funds, putting it in the general fund, and it just goes on and on and on.